Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. Every September since 2018, I've made it a goal to watch Ben 10 every September in some way. Up until 2021, I was watching each series in order, but in that same year, I only got halfway through Omniverse before I stopped due to lack of time. And I was gonna watch the second half this September, but decided I wanted to make list videos on the original series. So I rewatched season 1, and that led us here. Well, after a month or so of delay, this video is finally out. Ben 10 is an interesting show for me. It's not one I have a particular attachment to, other than liking it enough to check out the other shows in the series, and having a fun yearly tradition around that. And while I like it, I'd be lying if I said it was great overall. So why did I decide to talk about it? Well, because it's just a really fun show, with a great concept, and the show is just so interesting to talk about. It's also really solid overall, especially in the first 2 seasons. Most of the episodes are really good, and there are some truly fantastic ones, while also having some truly terrible episodes as well, even if they're in the minority of what the show has to offer. To talk more about Season 1 in specific though, it also falls into this camp. The season follows Ben learning how to use the Omnitrix through many threats, and showing him slowly maturing as a person while he is on this trip across the country. As I said, the concept of Ben having this watch that can turn him into 10 different aliens while he deals with threats around the country is a great one. And even in season 1, they have a lot of fun with it, especially since it's more about him learning about the watch and different aliens in the universe. They also get many great episode ideas out of this concept that involve cool monsters and even an interesting organization at one point. Not just aliens, which in a sense is cool. Though I wish we would have gotten to see more aliens this season overall, good or bad, to lead to more interesting episodes. I will say my biggest problem with the season are some episodes are just too simple and can kind of feel like a boring Monster of the Week plot, when in an interesting world like this, with cool aliens and interesting lore, even in season 1, we shouldn't be getting stuff like that. But this also leads to the world not really feeling as fleshed out as it could be in many ways. Which I know it's the first season, and they are setting things up, but how underdeveloped the world building is at points leads to episodes feeling underwritten. Both these issues are embodied in the worst of the season, but there are still many great qualities throughout the entire thing. The action is great in nearly every single episode, even some of the worst, and is top-notch in the best. The characters are really good. They're pretty fleshed out even for the first season, and they have great dynamics with each other. And the animation and atmosphere are also really strong, stronger than I remember it being. It's got a pretty unique style, even if the animation is still a little rough around the edges. But, with my thoughts on the first season overall out of the way, let's look at the episodes that embody the season's worst and best aspects. Here is my list of the top 3 worst and best Ben 10 Season 1 episodes. I'm doing a top 3 because the season is short, and I'll cover the other episodes in the honorable mention segment. Anyways, let's begin with Washington, BC is just a really boring episode. After a great series premiere that uses the show's concept in a fun way, we get a really dull follow-up. Dr. Animo is not a great villain in general in the original show, but he is just so bland here. He's just some crazy doctor who mutates animals and resurrects some and wants a reward. The stakes for this reason never feel super high, and I guess they don't have to, but I should still be invested in Ben taking this criminal down, especially when he has the power to resurrect animals. But they don't really do anything super interesting with that, and the mutant designs too are also just really bland. Yes, it's kind of interesting, as I said, that he's able to bring back prehistoric creatures, but they don't do a ton with it, so the conflict is still dull. After last episode, where Ben fights these cool robots being controlled by a scary alien, you expect to see more of that, but no, a boring scientist. And to be a little more fair, Ben 10 has a lot of unique villains that aren't just robots and aliens, but Dr. Animo, at least here, is not one of them. But another reason why I don't love this episode is that I don't find Ben or the connection between him and Animo super interesting. I get this is early on in Ben's journey, so the stuff involving him being annoying doesn't bother me, and I get why it's here. I just think other episodes early on look at some of Ben's more childish faults when he has the Omnitrix in a more interesting way. Here, Ben feels entitled to something because of the work he has done fighting crime, and through seeing Dr. Animo's actions, realizes that feeling entitled to anything is bad, and you have to earn things, which is such a boring message and way to develop your character, especially when the context around it also isn't interesting. They could have put an interesting spin on this whole plot, but they really didn't, so that ending message is just boring. The action is also super hit or miss, which is one of the only things the episode has going for it when it's good, but it's overall underwhelming. So yeah, this is just a weak episode early on, and one of the most boring of the show. What landed it this low, though, was some of the action is pretty good, the character writing is at least a little more interesting than the next two, and the atmosphere here is also pretty decent, even compared to some of the better episodes this season. But this is still a dud, and a weak offering from Season 1. Last Laugh is here for two reasons, the atmosphere and the ending. The story on its own is fine. I like the setup to the villain's plan, and the way they pull these heists off is interesting and leads to a fun plot. And Ben has a cool reason for not being affected by their scheme due to his fear of clowns, but that fear is also a double-edged sword, as it makes it hard for him to take down Zombozo. And this leads to some cool scenes between them and a good arc of Ben overcoming this fear. And it's really engaging to watch him try and take Zombozo down with this fear he has, especially after his cousin is kidnapped. But what excels all of this is the atmosphere and presentation. This episode has the best atmosphere of the season, and it is used to really add an unnerving element to every scene. And this helps add suspense as we get deeper into the story. And the artwork for this episode complements that perfectly. This is most prevalent in Zombozo, who is kind of a one-note villain and not that interesting, but the episode does such a good job making him menacing and so engaging to watch. He just eats up every scene he is in, and it makes you understand why someone afraid of clowns such as Ben would have a really hard time facing him. This element of the episode really excels everything else, and not only makes it great, but also really unique compared to every other episode in the season. And this would probably be enough to land it on the list, but the ending pushes it over the edge. After Ben goes through some really cool set pieces, his final confrontation with Zombozo is excellent. The whole scene is really cool visually, and the twist of Ben using Ghost Freak and scaring this clown is so good because we haven't seen much of that alien up until this point, and this is great foreshadowing of what Ghost Freak is capable of, and is a nice way to truly represent Ben getting over his fear by scaring this clown. The action in this episode is also great, by the way. But for any good Ben 10 episode, that's kind of a given. With all that said though, the reason such a unique episode like this isn't any higher is because I just find the next two a little more interesting. But this and my number 2 choice were very close in quality, and this one is still great. Both this and the episode I decided to put at number 1 are very close in quality. So don't think because I didn't make this episode my number 1 choice that it isn't awful. The Kraken is considered by many to be one of the worst of the series, and for good reason. While Washington, BC could be considered to be a generic Monster of the Week story, that episode had enough slightly interesting elements to make it only kind of bad, even if it is really boring. But this episode is just the worst, most generic Monster of the Week episode you will ever see, besides maybe the number 1 choice on this list. So here's the plot. Ben comes across a monster, people don't think it's real and think he's making it up, but then it turns out to actually be real. But the monster isn't actually harming anyone, it's just mad because these poachers, disguised as a wildlife protection agency, have captured its eggs. And there are also some weird other elements thrown in there, like there's a weird fisher dude who also wants the monster, but he's kind of a joke villain anyways. There is nothing interesting about this story. No cool twists or turns, only ones you see coming from a mile away. No interesting scenes or characters either. Every scene plays out how you think it would, with nothing of interest to offer, and all the added characters suck and are so generic, especially this poacher dude, who's one of the worst Ben 10 villains and is so boring. I don't even remember his name, and I'm not gonna look it up. I guess the same thing applies with the Fisher guy, but at least he is meant to be a joke villain, even if he doesn't contribute much and isn't funny, because they don't really play him for laughs. Yeah, I don't know, but the new characters suck, and the action is also kinda crummy here and doesn't bring up the episode at all, which is so strange because it's at least kind of good in nearly every other episode. But wait, I haven't even mentioned the monster yet, which is one of the worst and most boring of the series. The animation, while good, isn't that interesting and is rough compared to other early season 1 episodes. The only good thing is a few character interactions, and that's it. The episode is a disaster. Oh wait, it isn't, because at least the disaster would be interesting. There is nothing appealing about this episode, and the only reason it isn't number 1 is because I think the episode I put there has some bigger issues. Jeesh. This is the episode that got me into Ben 10. When I was first watching the show, this was the episode that really got me invested in watching more, and is the reason I kept watching and eventually watched the other shows as well. This was the episode that hooked me. Looking back, it isn't an exceptional episode as I may have called it at the time, and there is one episode this season that is better, but this is still a great one, in the first look we get into the series lore. The concept of 3 bounty hunters all competing to capture the Omnitrix from Ben is a great one, and it leads to an interesting conflict as unexperienced, immature 10-year-old Ben has to take on 2 very different but skilled aliens who want to kill him, and in a twist of events, has to deal with a 3rd alien who is a friend but doesn't trust in Ben's abilities to safely carry the watch. There's also a few great twists and turns, like how the bounty hunters, who actually are against each other, team up, and Ben has to deal with both of them at the same time to defeat them. And through this, starts to mature and learn strategy through combat, which is really cool, and a great way to end the episode. But the biggest reason this episode is great is the many action scenes we get out of the story, and just how fast-paced and fun it is throughout, as stuff is constantly happening. It keeps you on the edge of your seat the entire time. This episode definitely has some of the best action scenes of the show so far, especially the last fight. But the other thing that makes this episode amazing is we get our first look into the world and learn a little about the Omnitrix. It's not the most in-depth, but it's really cool, and it got many viewers, including myself, hooked, and is the building blocks for so much great world building to come. The reason this episode isn't number 1 though, is because the world building here is still kinda simple. and I know I said that was fine, but especially on rewatch, when you know about the Omnitrix, it's just not that interesting. Even though I think it's still a plus in the episode's favor. Also, some scenes just aren't fast-paced enough. Even if the episode overall is, it just doesn't always keep up incredible pacing. And while the action is great, if the pacing was a bit tighter, it could have been amazing. As it stands though, this was a great showcase of what Ben 10 could do early on, and was close to being the #1 episode, but we still have 2 more to go. But before we get into what my favorite and least favorite episode of the season is, here are 7 honorable mentions. Since there were a lot of good episodes this season, and only 13 total, I decided why not talk about all of them and give them a definitive ranking to see how they stack up against my top and bottom 3. So let's get into that. As I hinted at earlier, this is a great first episode for the series. It introduces our characters and the premise of the show well, has great intrigue around many of the events that happen, and has so much fun with its concept, showing Ben trying to use the Omnitrix in a few situations, some including cool action scenes. I really don't have many bad things to say about this episode. It was really close to making the top 3, but I think the episodes above are just more polished and have stronger highs. Still, this is one of the best of the season. And here's the runner-up for my worst list. In all fairness, the episode is decent, and not really bad at all, which goes to show how good the season is, but this is still one of the weaker episodes here. While the concept is fun, they just don't do anything super interesting with it. It's not a super memorable episode for this reason, but it can be pretty funny at points, and some of the weird places they do take this plot work. And I think that's enough to make it an enjoyable watch, but nothing more than that. Tourist Trap is in a similar boat as the last one, but this episode is much more entertaining and a lot funnier. I like this concept, and some of the weird places the episode goes with it, and many of the other weird aspects and jokes the episode has. It's pretty memorable, but once again, it's not that interesting in the long run. And there's nothing really that good here to take away from this. And the episode is very repetitive, and once the weirdness wears off, there's not much that this episode really has to offer. But it is still a good episode nonetheless. Kevin 11 was an episode I didn't like a lot the first time I watched it. I thought Kevin wasn't that interesting, and Ben was extremely annoying. And both these problems brought down the episode for me, but rewatching it, I think it's really good. I think Ben is annoying, but in a way that makes sense for a 10-year-old to be, especially one with this watch to be acting this way. And I think Kevin is an interesting character who is similar to Ben, but never had someone like Grandpa Max in his life to put him on the right track. I also think because of these 2 reasons, the story is really good. The action is also great, and there's some very cinematic moments here as well. I'd say my one issue that brings it down a bit is that the story and Kevin in general are a little underdeveloped, which makes it a little harder to get into the episode overall. But still, this is a good episode and a great introduction to Kevin, who becomes an amazing character later. I have similar thoughts on this episode as I did the last one, but I like it slightly less. The story of this episode is good, and it leads to a fun, intense conflict with a cool ending. I also like the look we get into Ben's character here through Grandpa Max getting injured, and him getting attacked. But I just don't think the episode goes far enough with its concept, as it could have really fleshed out some of the Ben character analysis stuff. But it ends up feeling underdeveloped, which is why the episode landed here. This is a fun episode, and the first look we get into magic in this world. There's a cool but pretty basic story that leads to some fun scenes and action, but it's not that interesting or special, and feels pretty standard overall. Pretty good though. I know some people really don't like this episode, but I think it's decent. The plot is pretty cliche for Ben 10 standards, but they do throw in some fun Ben 10 twists, especially in the back end with the Forever Knights, or the organization in this episode. But it takes too long to get to that point, and the rest of the episode is very simple, and not that interesting. Some of it is fun, but a lot of it isn't. And the back end with the Forever Knights just doesn't get enough time to play out. And while that part of the episode is better and more exciting, we don't get to learn about the Forever Knights at all. As I said, they're literally called the organization in this episode. And we just don't get to spend enough time with them for them to be that interesting. And that section of the episode is good, but it's nothing super special either. So this episode is just decent, through and through. But with that said, let's finally finish this list and get into what I consider the worst and best episodes of the season. While the Kraken is a terrible episode with a lot of huge issues, this one shares many similar problems but is even worse. I will say, as one plus right off the bat, this episode isn't entirely cliched, and is a bit more original than something like the Kraken is. But this is still a super generic episode, and an even worse monster bad guy of the week story. I'll get the biggest problem out of the way. The villain of the story sucks. He is super boring, from his design, to his motivation, to even his powers, and the escalation of Ben and gang trying to stop him from causing destruction is so crappy because the pacing is really bad, and the action in the story leaves so much to be desired. The episode, besides all of this, relies on a gimmick of Ben being sick and his aliens getting new powers, because they're also sick. Oh wait, that's not actually what happens, because that would be interesting. No, his aliens are just unable to fight and are actually sick, besides Heat Blast, who shoots ice now. Look, this limitation of Ben and his aliens being sick could have added another element of tension to the episode and made Ben's journey exciting, but they don't do anything interesting with it, because as I said, this story sucks, and the battles aren't good, and besides that, there really isn't anything interesting I have to say on this episode. It's just a boring one with a dull villain we really don't learn anything about, and it feels like our characters just kinda go through the motions while trying to stop him. And the gimmick of this episode isn't used well at all. This episode is just so bland and lifeless, and that's the worst thing you can be as an episode of a show as interesting as Ben 10 is. Even the Kraken is more interesting than this episode, and that's why it's the worst of Ben 10 Season 1. Unsurprisingly, I have a lot more to say about this one. Picking the #1 best episode for this list was one of the easiest decisions I've ever had to make. While I love the last 2 episodes I talked about, Secrets is without a shadow of a doubt one of the best of all the shows. While Season 1 has its problems, and its overarching story is underdeveloped, this episode takes everything that worked about the first season and puts it in the most action-packed adventure imaginable. Ben is still grappling with learning about responsibility and this watch, but is shrouded with the mystery of who this alien in his dreams is, and who's after him. But Grandpa seems to know, and the rest of the episode is Ben trying to escape Vilgax, an evil alien who has finally healed from his injuries in the first episode and is more dangerous than ever, while we slowly learn more about Grandpa's past and who Vilgax is, and what he wants to do with the Omnitrix. And for the first time in the show, the stakes feel really high. There were other episodes that had decent stakes, but nothing like this. This story is great, and as I said, takes all the best aspects of the season to make the episode just incredible. Ben has to deal with the toughest challenge he has ever faced up until this point, and has to make difficult decisions, both combat-wise and others, against an enemy who knows way more about his weapon, the Omnitrix, than he does. Even though he has spent all this time with it, it doesn't change the fact that Vilgax can time it out at any minute whenever he wants. He's also facing an enemy who will conquer the entire galaxy if he gets the Omnitrix, making this fight more important as he learns later on. The conflict really puts Ben's skill to the test, and it's also fun to watch because the action is incredible, and this episode is so fast-paced, always keeping the episode lively and making sure something is always happening. There's a few slower moments to break this up, but the episode has such an energy to it, and is paced how Hunted should have been throughout the entire thing. This episode is also an interesting watch because Vilgax is the best Ben 10 villain. He's not the most interesting, as he just wants the Omnitrix to conquer planets, but he's so intimidating, and such an interesting threat because of how powerful he is and how high the stakes become when he's around, making this epic battle even more epic. The last thing I'll mention is I love how after slight hints throughout the season that Grandpa Max isn't what he seems, in this episode throughout this big battle, you learn a ton of random information about him, proving that fact even more. And when the battle is over and Vilgax is defeated, it perfectly sets up Season 2, with Grandpa Max having some unsolved questions to answer. What more can I say about this episode? It's kinda perfect. It does pretty much everything right, and is so fun because of how action-packed and high energy it is throughout, while having some fun twists and turns to keep the episode lively and raise the stakes. It's truly one of the best episodes of the show, and easily in the top 2 of the original series. But there's one episode from next season that just might beat it out. But hey, we'll have to wait and see, and Secrets is still the best episode of Ben 10 Season 1. And with all that said, the list is done. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Also, leave a comment down below telling me what you thought of my list and what your own list would have been. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Lastly, links to music and other videos on this channel will be in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching once again. It was great to talk about a show I haven't talked about on this channel before, and I hope to talk about more in the future. But to give an update, for the rest of December, I'm just gonna post 1 or 2 more individual episode reviews, which will be on random episodes. I haven't picked them out yet. And at the end of the month, I'll be releasing the top 10 best Simpsons seasons 1 through 8 episode, to wrap up the year like I did last year with the SpongeBob list. And with all that said, thank you guys once again for watching, and until next time, this is Chocolate Guy signing off.